Look, we live in dangerous times. It is entirely possible to conceive in the very near future a gathering, misnamed, of world leaders that could have a re-elected Donald Trump, far-right US president, despite his attempt to overthrow, through encouraging an insurrection against the Constitution, the presidential results, to have the presence of someone like Javier Milei, the far-right, ultra-neoliberal president of Argentina, the presence of a fascist, the prime minister, the current prime minister of Italy, Giorgia Meloni, whose Fratelli d'Italia party is the direct successor of the MSI, which she joined as a 15-year-old, which was established by veterans of Mussolini's final Nazi collaborationist regime in 1946. Perhaps, let's hope not, they could be joined by Jordan Bardella, the fascist leader of Rassemblement National, National Rally in France, behind whom stands Marine Le Pen, deeply rooted in fascist politics. They could be joined in the autumn by someone who probably people don't know, and in one sense I hope we never get to know, a man called Herbert Kinkl, deeply sinister figure, the leader of the Austrian Freedom Party, who've been polling top of the polls for 2 years in Austria. There's a general election. Kinkl's party, the Freedom Party, was set up by former SS veterans in 1955 in Austria. This is what we face. We are closer to the 1930s than any of the intervening decades. But this meeting is not a gospel of despair. And let me just make two immediate points. When I say closer to the 30s, not identical, not identical. And in particular, and most crucially, we have not suffered anywhere, despite the advances of fascist forces, the shattering defeats that marked the rise of Hitler to power, the Austrian fascists, Franco's victory in the 1930s. Secondly, the 1930s itself was not simply an inexorable march of fascism, war, genocide, and so on. It was also a decade marked by moments, when I say moments, 2 or 3 years really in the middle of that decade, particularly from 1934 to 1936, 37, above all in France and Spain, of mass working class resistance that opened the door to revolution, and were often initiated by responses to fascist moves towards power. That we saw radical uprisings in response. In other words, as we again live through a decade of crisis, of polarization, like the 30s, there's a coexistence of reaction and resistance, of revolution and counter-revolution that we saw in the 1930s. Both exist. And that means the victory of one or the other isn't predetermined. What decides between these two tendencies, then and now, are questions of politics, strategy, and organization, or their absence. In other words, we're not simply doomed to repeat the disasters of history. It's an open-ended question. Nothing is predetermined. Right? And therefore, this isn't simply about the dangers. It is about the dangers, but it's crucially then how we act. This is what we have to think about. Now, what I want to try and do in this meeting, and there's been other meetings at the event, I want to try to answer the question, to try to understand what the nature of fascism, to arm anti-fascists. I'm going to do 3 things. I'm going to look at and draw on some historical experience briefly, the nature of fascism, to try to clarify it for people, what's particular about fascism. Then I'm going to look at 21st century fascism. How is it similar? How is it not? Because this is contested. Many people would deny that these are fascist parties. Comrades will have questions. And then drawing out of that, hopefully with a forgiving chair about the time, we'll see, I want to outline 6 strategic imperatives for anti-fascists that I think flow out of it. Okay. What is fascism? there's immense confusion on this topic. So what I want to do is look at the most highly developed form of fascism and the most brutal expression of fascism, which is German Nazis, just to try to make the thing clearest. I was thinking about this and how to address it. I think one of the most prevalent misconceptions about the Nazis, which you still hear, is that the Nazi Party was simply a direct creation of the German ruling class. Sometimes people talk about a tool of the German ruling class, an instrument. It was created and funded by big business. It created and directed from above. In truth, it was much more dangerous than that. It was much more dangerous than that because although at different points, the state certainly did help facilitate and so on, and ultimately bargained with the Nazis over leaving them into power. You still read books, by the way, that talk about the seizure of power by them. This is not true. It wasn't a coup. They were invited into power, but nonetheless, they developed as a mass movement. This is the crucial point, as a mass movement from below. And that means that they build a mass base for their extreme form of reaction in society. And therefore, when they enter into power, you're not simply looking at a traditional military coup or police state. They have this mass movement. Leon Trotsky, the Russian revolutionary, brilliantly described as like a battering ram that's directed at their enemies. You don't just face the policeman, you face the ideological, fanatical street fighter. I'll come back to this. Now, the Nazis stood in elections. People probably know some of this history. In 1930, they make their big breakthrough. They get 18% of the vote. 1932, I think it gets up to 32, 33% of the vote. Never a majority, but they stood in elections. But their aim, and this is what really marks them off from more electoral far-right parties, was not to simply then take part in parliamentary politics. Their aim was the destruction of all forms of democracy, even in its limited version under capitalism. Because liberal capitalist democracy, we know it's not a vehicle for challenging capitalism, but it involves certain concessions, crucially to the organized workers' movement. It varies, it fluctuates, but the ability to form trade unions, freedom of assembly, the right to press, it's always contested, but that's the concession that's involved. And what the Nazis' project is to smash the entirety of the organized working class. And that must also mean smashing every element of democracy. And not just to smash once, but to create a state in which there is no space for the workers' movement to reorganize, to hold it in permanent tension, permanent annihilation of the workers' movement. Therefore, if you like, what we are dealing with fascism is a counter-revolutionary mass movement from below that aims at the destruction of the entirety of the working class. When I say entirety, not just the revolutionary left, the social democrats, the worst trade union official that you know. Just think about that for a moment. The one that never does anything, never wants to fight or sells out. In 1933, those people would have also been tossed into Dachau or a makeshift concentration camp. Some of them would be killed. Many of them would just be beaten up, and tossed back. And they decided never again. They would retreat from politics and so on, right? So it was aimed at the entirety of the working class. We have to understand that point. Now, to do that, as I suggested, requires more than just a desire to do it. And elections aren't enough. To carry through that project requires a second arm of the fascist elections, which is the street forces. And not just protesting on the street, that can be the beginning of it, but the development of what could you call it, a party militia, paramilitary organization. And the classic example is, of course, the Sturmabteilung, the storm detachments, the stormtroopers, the brown shirts. I think in 1930, Hitler had 100,000. And these people were being directed, they were willing to risk life and limb in a confrontation with what was then the biggest and strongest workers' movement in the world, right? I think by 1932, 33 on the eve of power 300,000. This is very, very serious. Right? So it's that combination that we have to think about. Now, there's two more points I want to make to understand fascism, which I think are useful and are useful when we come on to the 21st century. And I want to talk about the masks that the fascists wear. And I think there are two. One is that they are capable, and Hitler's movement does this at points as well, of concealing this counter-revolutionary, anti-democratic agenda and so on, or at least its full intent, with a degree of respectability, legitimacy. Hitler was capable of saying he would respect the constitution. He had no intention of doing all these things, right? And they put on a mask, partly through standing in the electoral process and so on, of hiding their aims. That's one mask that they wear. But the second mask is also important, which I'm going to describe. They disguise a counter-revolutionary movement as revolutionary. I would describe it as pseudo-revolutionary in the sense of fake, right? So if you look at, I don't know, say, the Nazis' program or some of its rhetoric and so on, they will talk about, at points, opposing the system, plutocrats, big business, even high finance, and so on. Joseph Goebbels, infamous as Hitler's propaganda minister, was the Gauleiter, the Nazi leader sent into Berlin, Red Berlin, home of the Communist Party and so on, to build. He produced a newspaper in 1927 that had as its subtitle, "For the oppressed against the exploited." To the superficialist, that could almost have a whiff of anti-capitalism. Of course, it's, you know, how to describe it? What they're doing, if you like, here is taking some of the anger at the system and displacing that onto the international plane. It's not healthy German capitalists, it's international forces, which are then equated with the Jews. And it's a way of saying that the discontents, the tensions produced by capitalism can be removed, not by removing capitalism, but by removing the Jews. So they displace the tensions of a capitalist society in crisis onto the international plane, which is then equated with Jews. And the argument is, if we get rid of the Jews, we can recreate this utterly reactionary image of some kind of people's community, the Volksgemeinschaft, if we eradicate alien elements above all the Jews. And you can see that there is a genocidal logic built into that pseudo-revolutionary image and so on. So it's an utterly reactionary fantasy. Now, very good, interesting. That's the 1930s. We all know the argument is, well, what's that? Surely things have changed. Surely these are different kind of parties, dangerous and so on, but are they different? Where are we with the 21st century fascists? Let's just take the votes. They stand in elections. The Alternative for Deutschland in Germany, which has a growing and powerful Nazi wing, is on about, what, 15, 16% in the polls? Not that far off from what Hitler got in 1930. Rassemblement National in the European elections a few weeks ago got 33%. Actually very similar to what Hitler got in 1932. Okay, so they are gathering millions of votes around them. The road to their electoral breakthrough, how has this happened? It has been paved by centrist, mainstream, liberal and conservative forces, and sometimes, frankly, social democratic forces. The intensification of Islamophobia, the militarization of borders against refugees. Don't think it's just a Rwanda plan, Fortress Europe, and so on. The authoritarian tendencies that we see, increased police powers against protest, increased police violence, and so on. These all create a favorable environment for the Nazis to feed off. I gave this example in a meeting yesterday. A German interior minister in 2018, Horst Seehofer, conservative, said, Islam has no place in Germany. This became the slogan of the AfD. But it's projected into the public arena on a huge scale by conservative forces. And then the Nazis say, we agree, but we're serious about doing something about it. You know, Macron's Islamophobia, his disbanding of Muslim organizations that fight Islamophobia, the level of police violence, and so on. These pave the way. They legitimize the themes of the fascists, and they build the fascist base. They don't undermine them. And the fascists are then able, and see this very clearly in France, to then act as a pole of attraction for traditional, especially traditional conservative forces. You know, the fact that the French Gaullists, which has been the dominant conservative tradition, have seen their base crumble. They've now split, with one section looking to form electoral alliances with the Nazis and so on. This is the kind of pattern you saw in the late 1920s in Germany, right? So this is what's taking place. So the 21st century fascists deploy both masks. There's a mask of legitimacy. What does Le Pen and the Rassemblement National talk about? You might have heard this phrase, de-diabolization, de-demonization, right? They're trying to pitch a certain legitimacy and a certain respectability. It means trying to mask some of the open anti-Semitism. And actually, the Islamophobia of the French state has been a godsend to them, you know. That's what they can use as a battering ram. But the anti-Semitism is still there. I want to give one example. I'll give another in a second. Marine Le Pen's organization has now moved away from open, in public at least, open Holocaust denial. You know, when Jean-Marie Le Pen says these things, he was expelled. But Marine Le Pen says the French state bears no responsibility for the Holocaust. This is a lie. I'm sorry. It's a lie. The French state was utterly complicit in deportation of French Jews. So it's a form of Holocaust denial light, right? It's still there. Giorgia Meloni says the same thing. She will even say the Holocaust was a crime, but the Italian state had nothing to do with it. This is a lie. People should read John Foote's book, Blood and Power, to go through it, right? So they're sending messages here to their supporters and so on. Do they use the other mask? Yes. There's a pseudo anti-establishment, even sometimes a pseudo anti-capitalist, particularly organized around a phrase they used, they denounce globalism. Globalism. That can sound, you know, the left has sometimes talked about being opposed to globalization in the sense of capitalist globalization, became a shorthand, you know, for the expansion of the world market and so on. But for the fascists, again, the fault line they're trying to draw attention to isn't between labor and capital, worker and bosses. It's between the national and the international. And they identify, you know, point to a few big tech firms or to finance. And this stuff can easily then slip into anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. Who are your examples? George Soros, the Jewish, constantly invoked. Marine Le Pen, she won't openly talk about Jewish, but it will always be Jewish names that she gives. So again, it's that ambivalence and double language. Plausible deniability they can retreat from, but it sends a signal to their supporters. Do they have the street forces? Nazi street gangs do exist, but they are much weaker. More like in the hundreds, probably, in somewhere like France. But they are being emboldened as Marine Le Pen rises, and they're more confident. There have been a number of attacks by Nazi groups, and Nazi groups taken to the streets and so on. But at the moment, they have nothing like the hundreds of thousands of supporters that Hitler had. Now, how much time do I have? That's okay, actually. This raises a question. And when I've done these meetings, sometimes this is a question I've sometimes faced in conversation. And I think it's an important one. Because sometimes you get an argument that says, yes, they are fascist, but do they need the stormtroopers? Aren't the forces of the state, you know, the militarized police and so on, isn't that enough? Now, the idea of Bardella or Le Pen in charge of the French police and so on, we have no complacency. It's a very, very dangerous development. And we know there's huge amounts of support for the fascists in the state. But nonetheless, to carry through the kind of shattering defeat of the organized working class, in other words, to not just have vicious attacks, but to liquidate any possibility of resistance, I still think they have to ultimately have a mass force of ideological street fighters to carry it through. I don't think that using the state is, through electoral means is a substitute for that. I think the danger is they can use the state to further broaden their base. Not just the legitimacy of being prime minister and so on, but attempts to recast the state along more authoritarian lines. I mean, Le Pen wants to get rid of dual nationality, to break the link between being born in a country and citizenship. This will be directed at people, black and brown people. They want to remove welfare services and housing, or you call it national preference. This is always, in other words, begin to create an element of an apartheid state. Right? You create this kind of atmosphere in society, the possibility, especially if the crisis in society deepens, that a section of the people who vote for you today can be convinced to take to the street to attack the left and so on exists tomorrow. This is a danger. But here's the key point here. At the moment, their votes rest on quite a small nucleus. I mean, I'd be interested in any French communist assessment of just how big Rassemblement National. They don't have millions of members. They don't have hundreds of thousands of members. They have a bigger than we want, but their nucleus is still relatively weak compared to the 19th. And that means they're vulnerable, very vulnerable, to sustained anti-fascist pressure, right? So what I want to end on then is my six, I think it's six, strategic imperatives from anti-fascists that flow out of that. And these are headlines, and I hope people might flesh them out and so on. Firstly, they wear a mask, so we have to unmask them. You have to re-demonize. This has challenges. Jeff Brown, who's in the audience, who's writing a history of the Anti-Nazi League in the late 70s. And, people like John Tyndall, the leader of the NF, you could dig out photos of them wearing Hitler uniforms in the 60s and just hold them up, right? They're cleverer than that now. They've learned. You have to trace the links. You have to point to decode the language. There's a undercover expose that's just taken place of Maloney's Fratelli d'Italia youth group. It's riddled with open fascism and celebration of the Nazis and so on. These things have to be used to win the argument that this is not a normal party. It's not just a question of saying, ha-ha, they're fascists and it's problem solved. The point is that then leads to the second argument. If they are fascists, if they're not a normal party, then they have to be denied a presence in the public arena. They shouldn't be on television. They shouldn't. Now, that's quite hard when they've got 33% of the vote. But for God's sake, let's start with having a protest outside the radio interview and so on. And when they book the hall for an election meeting in your community, there needs to not just be a protest, but an attempt to shut it down. When they have a stall in the market square, they have to shut it down. This is the kind of thing we have to begin to win amongst big layers of people. Third strategic imperative, don't ally with the liberal centre. Don't form electoral combinations with the liberal centre in belief that that's the lesser evil, both because it's the liberal centre that's often the engine of creating the environment that these people can grow. But, and in the election today, it's right to say, vote for the Nouveau Popular Front, but in a whole number of seats, you won't be able to because it's withdrawn. And in some cases, that means you're being encouraged to vote for the worst Macronist ministers who've driven through many of these racist and neoliberal attacks. What does Bardella do? He goes on the telly and says, from Mélenchon to Macron, they're all part of the same system, you see. We're the alternative. It strengthens them. Secondly, the lesser evil argument. We have to back a Clinton against a Trump, Macron against. The problem is that the ruling class and their political representatives like Macron and so on, they have a theory of the lesser evil. For them, the lesser evil is the fascists. The left is the real enemy. And they will do deals with the fascists. In 1932, the Social Democrats in Germany, there's a presidential election. They withdrew their candidate and said, vote for President Hindenburg. Hindenburg was an aging reactionary, a Prussian landowner, who had been the co-dictator of Germany in the First World War and the slaughter of the trenches. And they said, vote Hindenburg to stop Hitler. Hindenburg won. 7 months later, Hindenburg appointed Hitler as chancellor. A better slogan would have been, vote Hindenburg, get Hitler. We have to be clear about these things. That means, fourth strategic imperative, it's about building a mass movement a mass movement against the fascists, not relying on the state or the liberal centre. And we have to understand that for all their millions of votes, we are the majority on the streets. Think about the Palestine demos. You think about the climate strikes. You think about Black Lives Matter. Again and again, in country after country, the pension strikes in France and so on. The left has been able to mobilize vastly bigger numbers, vastly bigger numbers. The strategic challenge is to win people in those movements to the necessity of building direct opposition to the Nazis, not just protests against racism, that's crucial, but winning the argument that says we have to directly target their organization, to put pressure, to isolate their hard nucleus from their softer, wider support, to break their organization. That means that there is a crucial responsibility on the anti-capitalist left. The anti-capitalist left is not focused on elections and parliaments. Our stock in trade is building movements, struggle from below. So we have a particular responsibility to build such movements. Now, at the same time, I think I'm on to my sixth and final strategic imperative. The anti-capitalist left cannot build that movement just alone. We cannot put barriers up to the involvement of people who don't share the full anti-capitalist program. It has to be an attempt, sustained, patient, of winning and understanding, winning alliances with the wider left and the wider trade union movement of the necessity of this strategy. In other words, it has to be what's described as the united front. You know, people sometimes say the problem in Germany, in fact, was a lack of unity. It's not just about unity. It's about unity in action, right? It's about building a mass mobilization that says these people are fascists and we have to drive them out of the public arena and put pressure on their organization to break it. The fascism needs more than elections to fully succeed and smash the left. It needs a mass base, votes, but also on the streets. It needs a ruling class that's willing to break with liberal democracy. But finally, it requires a left that fails to build this kind of unity in action that can destroy them. That's a schema. Frederick Engels, you know, Marx's collaborator, used to sometimes like to quote I think it's a Yorkshire saying, I'll give it to Yorkshire anyway, the proof of the pudding's in the eating, right? The test of any theory is what you do. And here again, I just want to say that I think the experience, you know, the British left hasn't always done everything, you know, we want to do and so on. But there's a very rich experience in Britain of confronting the fascists, going back to the anti-Nazi League. You know, again, as I said yesterday, don't be any points they have broken through. The National Front in the 1970s was on its way to becoming the third biggest party. The BNP in the 90s made a breakthrough, and it ended up with 50 councillors, and I think it's nearly 1 million votes. The English Defence League was on the streets in the 2010s. Tommy Robinson, you know, they're trying again. But even there, you can see the different organisations. Why? It's because the far left, and by that I mean the SWP, because who've acted on this tradition, have repeatedly won an argument with the wider left, with the wider trade union movement, about this kind of strategy, and that means we have repeatedly smashed them. I don't think this was easy. You know, sometimes it took a very sustained effort and so on. But the point is they've never been able to consolidate themselves. The tragedy in France is it's been 40 years where the Rassemblement National, the former National Front, have been able to put down roots in society. And we now see a very, very dangerous situation it develop. And therefore, we cannot have any complacency. We saw what happened in the election. We have a far-right electoral party under Farage, Tommy Robinson attempting to rebuild a Islamophobic street movement with a fascist core, and there's a danger of them, you know, feeding off each other and so on. So this is not, wow, we thought of them in the past, no problem. No, no, no. Each time it's a huge test. When we face this test, again, they want to draw, they gain confidence from what's happening in Europe. confidence. If Trump wins, they get more confident, right? But we have to act with an understanding of confidence that this has been done before and it can be done again. We have immense reserves on our side. We have to strategically mobilize them. Like we saw a glimpse of in Essen, the 70,000 and so on. This is the kind of thing that we have to think about strategically how we do. If we build on this tradition, we can break them again. Yeah.
Hello. I'm from Egypt, and I was wondering, so in Egypt, we had like a revolution in 2011, and it started with like the educated middle class, with like the political parties, the elite. And then when the working class, when the lower classes people joined, it was actually when the people actually defeated the police state, and the police actually ran from the streets. And that's when we actually had the revolution taking place and taken hold. And that's when it actually like made a threat to the regime in Egypt. But unfortunately, after the revolution, there was like a huge like debates about like the religion of the state, of the constitution, and like most of the elites, most of the parties didn't care about like the lower classes and the working classes and the people who actually carried the revolution. And in my view, that contributed to like 2 years later with the military coup, the counter-revolution. Most people, I'd say, accepted and aided with the counter-revolution. I think of this a lot with, for example, when I see in Britain, like we have the numbers, we have like in marches and for Palestine, for like climate emergency, for Black Lives Matter in cities, we have lots of people. But I wonder if it's only just like a specific class, like is it just like university people? Is it just like people who, I don't know, higher middle class people who can afford like to be engaged in such activities? Does the movement here engage with like people in like the countryside and like in smaller cities with working class? Because I don't really like, I'm not sure, maybe like I'm just like not fully aware of it, but I really want to know if that's the case. Because if we actually want to engage with like fascism, if we actually want to engage with like this mass mobilization that you mentioned that actually like brings up fascism, we need to engage with these classes, with these people. So that's my question. Like, if this happens in England, or like, if it doesn't happen, how could we bring it up? And yeah, thanks.
Hello, everyone. First of all, thank you for the festival and for the speech as well. Yeah, I'm a member of March 21 in Barcelona, Spain. And also I belong to a movement, Unity Against Fascism and Racism. So we in this movement of unit struggle against fascism and racism, we are several people belonging to different left parties, and we have this common objective. But now I was talking with a colleague here, and what surprises me and is more difficult for me as a human being, not a member of anything, is how difficult for me is to rebate in Spain migrants who support extreme right. Yeah, it's not an easy thing to do, and I am starting not to rebate. I start to listen and to make questions. Yeah. Because as a person, it is really surprising and also really difficult to understand how migrants, my parents were migrants, and sometimes they say racist and fascist sentences, yeah, and they were immigrants in Germany, France, etc. So it's, yeah, it's a sharing, yeah. Thank you.
I've got the copy.
Okay, comrades. I think that Mark's introductory remarks were incredibly valuable to give us a framework about how to operate over the next period inside this country. And it was interesting when he was talking about Goebbels and how Goebbels in 1927 identified with the oppressed and the exploited. And after all, the Nazi Party was the party, its name was the National Workers' Socialist Party. And they made a clear attempt to relate to the disaffected working class. And if you fast forward to the situation in Britain today, the reform slogan, Britain is broken, is an appeal to what is the experience of all of us, whether it comes to dentists, whether it comes to the National Health Service, rents, God knows what else, climate change, and so on. And I think that within that context, what happened on Thursday night in the British general election has to be regarded as a watershed, because it's not just the fact that Reform UK got 4 million votes. The even more worrying statistic is that in 102 constituencies, which Labour won, Reform were the second party. In Barnsley, for instance, they got 33%. And then, and again, Mark pointed this out, you have to swivel across the channel to understand that we've gone through the process of both Macron in France and Scholz in Germany saying, vote for us to block the rise of the hard right. And in fact, as the Socialist Worker very accurately has pointed out over the last few weeks, far from blocking the rise of the right, actually, they've opened the path to the right. And to be honest, comrades, I await the results at 8 o'clock tonight on the exit poll with huge trepidation, and the tectonic plates are moving. Now, I think Mark has helped us understand all this, but I think that we also have to finish on what he finished with. I mean, years ago, I was associated with the Anti-Nazi League, and comrades, the threat of the Nazis in the 1970s was real. Comrades had their face smashed. There were horrible, violent confrontations inside East London, up in Manchester, and so on. And it was quite daunting, comrades. But we managed to do it because we adopted what, again, Mark was suggesting, the united front. We need to draw together all those forces. We're not alone in being worried about the future, and we need to draw those forces together into a united front similar to the one which we built with the Anti-Nazi League. And
Can you wrap up?
Yeah, therefore we have to be both analytical in how we see the development of the fascists, but at the same time offer a serious way forward.
I'm from Socialism from Below, from Germany. We are here as a comrade group, and we participated in the Essen mass protest against the AfD. Yeah, it was a very successful mobilization against AfD, and a very important one. And in addition to that, we also had mass mobilization in Berlin in front of the parliament against AfD. And the thing with these mobilizations is that what happened in Berlin at the mobilization in front of the parliament was that there was a Palestine bloc that was mainly consistent of people who were of Palestinian or Arab descent. And they were attacked by the white German anti-AfD protesters. And they were also attacked by the police and kicked out of the protest. And this is, of course, in addition to extreme racism people are experiencing. And what happened, unfortunately, but also understandably, is that now among people non-white and people who have Muslim background or anything like that, they feel like excluded from this fight. And also there's the second sentiment is that this is not their problem. Like Nazism is the problem of people with a Nazi background, like white Germans. Like these are the two notions. There's a fear and this. And while I understand this, and I personally also sometimes have these feelings, as a socialist, I'm for creating a united front. So my question is that I'm asking myself in Germany, and because I'm discussing with my friends who have these feelings, like how can we, on the one side, protect them within the anti-AfD movement, that they will not be violated in these ways anymore? And also, how can we yeah, I don't know, be more inclusive, and also, I don't know how to, that they participate in these fights. Like, I think we need strategies. And maybe, do you have experience on this in the UK or elsewhere? Like, I'm also wondering what the other comrades' experience is. Thank you.
Hi. I wondered what you thought of the phrase neoliberal fascism as a concept, and it's used very much by the Alliance for Black Peace, for example, to describe Biden. I mean, you're always saying Trump and front, whatever. So I'd like to put a bit of context to this AFD thing in that. So I'm prosecuted in Germany for writing on my personal Facebook whilst living in London, England, whilst commenting on The Guardian. I called Olaf Scholz a neoliberal fascist pig, right? I'm very famous in Germany for calling the Chancellor a pig. Don't type Bild or Axel Springer in my name, right? So I got sentenced to a 12,000 euro fine, which is several months in prison if I don't pay it or choose not to pay it or announce publicly I'm not going to pay it. And I've just been convicted and sentenced just recently in the state of Hesse. Yeah, so, but why you're talking about these normal parties like the so-called traffic light coalition in Germany? It's Olaf Scholz who is saying, like, all my white German friends, they're just like, I said this comment 2 years ago, but I got prosecuted. They're like, you were just ahead of your time, like, because I mean, Olaf Scholz on the front cover and Der Spiegel says we need to do mass deportations at a faster rate. Like, that's a far right policy, right? As far as I'm concerned, objectively. It's the Greens and the FDP who are talking about banning Al Jazeera, who are calling the black footballers like Antonio Rudiger, who in Germany, ISIS, and
You have a
you don't
minute.
need, yeah. So just one other thing, the AFD actually personally targeted me. The AFD, they hate artists. I'm a British artist. I exhibited in a place called Documenta in Germany. Made work about halal fried chicken, which was put into the official German anti-Semitism guide. Yeah, they're still targeting me, Muslim artists, leftists. And what can we do in Britain? There's only 2 small events outside the German embassy, but we need to do a lot more.
Yeah, I had a couple of questions relating to the situation in France, because I agree it's absolutely imperative to build a united front to hit the fascists hard. But I also got the problem that there's a problem on the French left, some of the French left, in that they've accepted so many racist ideas. For instance, you know, banning of the hijab under the guise of secular republicanism. So how is that a real problem? I don't know. Maybe the French comrades can also talk about that. Because it seems to me that if you've got racist ideas yourself, it kind of hampers your ability to really tackle the Nazis. And then the second question was about how Le Pen might come to power and use that power. As Marx said, that he didn't think that they would be able to use the apparatus of the state in this, they still needed this kind of street army. But what about a situation like Portugal? I mean, I think we wouldn't say that Portugal during the dictatorship was a classic fascist regime, but it was a very powerful right-wing regime, and it did use the apparatus of the state. It also had like 1 in 5 people were supposedly informers, and it famously, of course, it was smashed by revolution. But that, you know, it's 50 years after the state came into being. So I just wondered, you know, to what extent could Le Pen somehow get control of the police, the army, and somehow use that to push towards a more right-wing authoritarian regime like exists in Portugal? Thanks.
Thanks, Mark. I found the description of what fascism is to be really important. And I think that we need to continue to build that understanding through our united front work. I just wanted to talk a little bit about what we did early last year in Cannock in smashing the fascists that came around the hotels that were housing people awaiting for their asylum claims to be processed. And 2 of the things that we focused on that Mark talked about was unmasking the fascists for who they are and splitting the local racists from the fascists. And we did this through a united front approach, and that was absolutely central to our success. In unmasking, we, of course, the fascists did exactly what Marx said, and they went into the communities that are suffering and told them that they had the answers to their problems. And we need to be so much louder on the left to put forward our answers, to our anti-capitalist answers to those problems. But also we used the Hope Not Hate have significant problems, but the data that and the information that they provide was absolutely essential in our campaign to unmask the fascists. We put out leaflets, door-to-door, street stalls. We made online infographics talking about who these individuals were. Who is this random person that nobody has ever seen in Cannock who lives in Stoke? And what is his background and who is he connected to? And building it all the way back to Mark Collett and the photos of him with swastikas behind him. Because, of course, the fascists from Stoke we hadn't got those kind of photos that Marx talked about. So that was really important in order to split the racists from the fascists. At the end of the protests, it was the racists that actually told the fascists that they were no longer welcome on their demonstration. And I think that shows that what we did was successful, and we need to continue to build on that. And just speaking to the comrade who asked about Palestine, Tommy Robinson's coming to London on the 27th, and we have been starting to build the Stand Up to Racism coaches in the Palestine movement. We've already been talking about Islamophobia in the Palestine movement. We have got a door in there to bring these two movements together. So good luck, comrades, with everything that we've got ahead of us.
I just want to follow up what's just been said about looking at how a united front is actually built. I think when we look at the rest of Europe, there is a real problem that you don't get the sense that the revolutionary left as a whole understands how you can keep your political independence. You can put all of your political arguments at the same time as on the one issue of stopping the fascists, you work together with anybody who's willing to sign up to that one particular part of political project. And I think that's something which we need to be clear we have established in this country. When we look at the way in which we've been part of the Palestine movement, I think it's very important to recognize that that ability to unite with people in this tradition that we've built, it goes back indeed, not actually to the anti-Nazi, it goes back to the Right to Work campaign, where we built a united campaign against unemployment on the grounds that people in the Labour Party would not accept a revolutionary position, but would actually nevertheless agree, as all workers do, you want to fight unemployment. And you then move to the argument you want to fight fascism. And then you want to make sure you can unite against the Iraq war by making sure that everybody who's against the war can join. And you make a point of recognizing in the racism of our society that you have to have Muslims in the leadership of the movement. And we have the Muslim Association of Britain in the leadership of Stop the War from 2001. And that way in which you make that unity has actually created, I would argue, a key element of the strength of the Palestine solidarity movement in this country, where you have the whole of those all forces united yesterday on the demonstration. You could see that. And we're actually making an international impact to the way in which we've been able to push this idea that unite despite your differences on the one project. You do so, and I can talk at length about this, but you do so very clearly without abandoning your own politics. We are always there. Everybody knows we're selling them the paper. We're trying to get them to join us, because actually the real forces on the ground that start the United Front is the revolutionary left. Be very clear, without the SWP, there would have been no anti-Nazi League, and that without the ability to understand and with courage make the United Front work, it won't happen. And that's the real challenge that the left faces in Britain and indeed in the wider Europe today. Thank you.
Brilliant.
I just want to come back to the question someone raised earlier about the phrase neoliberal fascist and whether or not that's a phrase we should use. And to be honest, I don't think it is one we should use. And that's not at all to downplay the horrific right-wing attitudes you see from some centrist and liberal figures and everything like that. But the reason I say that is because if we're seeing them as fascists, then we're admitting defeat before it's happened. And beyond that, we're missing them for the role that they play, right? If you look at when fascism rose in Germany, the stance of the Comintern at the time under Stalin's orders was a theory called social fascism, right? Which is sort of, a similar phrase to neoliberal fascists. It was pointing at groups like the SPD, which is sort of their equivalent of the Labour Party, but even more to the left than even Jeremy Corbyn, and saying they're the real fascists because they're the ones that get us to this point and everything like that. And then what happened because of that was the socialists, the communists in Germany refused to form a united front with them because they were so opposed to them. Absolutely understandably. I mean, they called Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht in the past these huge revolutionary figures. But because they refused to unite with them against Hitler and everything, they were instead united in the camps. They were some of the first ones to go in there. So with that in mind, I think it's important that we talk about how we operate when we are fighting against fascism, because it's absolutely correct that we do not ally ourselves with liberal figures or everything, or have illusions that we just need to vote people in. But we instead need to operate on our own terms, right? There's this understanding between the difference of the Popular Front and the United Front. The Popular Front, again, you saw in the Second World War, again, with Stalin playing a role in it, unsurprisingly, where you had communists and socialists all over the world in the Comintern, basically subordinating their actions to bourgeois interests. You had them saying, right, we need to do everything we can to fight back Hitler, so work for the war machine, work for Stalin, work for Truman, work for Churchill. You had in the US, I know, for example, they were calling for no strikes whatsoever because they need to support the war. How ridiculous is that? You're socialists, you need to understand that if we are going to fight for things, if we are going to fight against fascism, it needs to come from below. And that is the point of the united front. Yes, there are times where we need to have people a right flank. For example, stand up to racism. We've got people from the Labour Party in there. But the reason that happens is not because we think they're going to be the ones to fight fascism or anything, but because people have illusions in those figures, in liberal democracy and everything. When we have those figures calling people down, saying, come down to this demonstration, it gets people down, it gets that mass movement going. And that's what we need to keep in mind. When we are having these united fronts, it's not that we're having illusions in these other liberal figures or anything, but we need to understand that if we're going to fight fascism, there needs to be no ticket for entry besides you want to oppose fascism. And I'll wrap up there. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah, apologies for my voice, which is gone, but from shouting at Farage. But I want to go back to the thing about the quote from Tony Cliff, the founder of the Socialist Workers' Party, when he said, in the 90s about it kind of being like a situation of the 1930s in slow motion. And he said that when you when you watch the film in slow motion, it gives you more time to stop it and direct it how you want to see it go. And, obviously now the whole concept of the film speeding up is something that I think really is quite a good description of what we can see in front of us. I think it's important, that it's not 1933. The fact that the fascists have had such a success in rebranding themselves in Europe and going an electoral path without having to, without actually building up the street army in the same way as they did. You look at both Italy and Germany, they had a long build up where this was built up underneath. And I think we do now have a discontented middle class layer, the social base of fascism and so on, that's been hit hard by the crisis, but it's not been organised in that way. We've had this big breakthrough for fascism electorally, but not on the street. But actually, if you speak to the comrades in France, I think we have to look at how these things can develop, because obviously there is not that organised street gang thing, but there are an increase in attacks. There's an increase in attacks just from what we'll see with the advance of Reform UK and the racism that's been pushed in Britain, and these things can develop very, very quickly. I think in Britain, obviously the fascist movement in particular is extremely weak. I don't know, but none of the handful of candidates that stood got their deposits and all this kind of stuff. But the dangers we face is that these things can kind of you know, there's a crossover and a fluid connection between these things. So while Farage is absolutely not a fascist, he's a racist populist, his breakthrough electorally can combine with the ability of Robinson to break through on the streets. And I think we have to be very, very clear about that. Yeah, so when Mussolini joked about how the Italian socialists failed to even get out on the streets and take the initiative against them, or when Hitler said that we had to smash he didn't say we had to smash the nucleus. He said he would have been stopped if the nucleus had been smashed to fascism. We need to take that very, very seriously and not be complacent. And so we have a big test on the 27th of July. But like the comrade over there said about the connections with the socialist movement and the Muslim and Muslim people in Britain, that's a unique situation that I think is also not completely unrelated to how big and vibrant and combative the Palestine demos have been here. So we have the streets right now, but we have to take the threat of fascism very, very seriously, and we have to find a way to fight inside the movement around Palestine and much wider in terms of social weight trade unions to bring big numbers around to stop Robinson on the 27th. And we have to recognise the role of socialists in that and build a bigger organisation.
Right.
Okay, I'm going to try to reply to the questions until the chair stops me. Let me just say, if you want to read more, I think Trotsky's writings on the struggle are indispensable. I would also actually very much recommend this book. Paxton was an American historian of Vichy France. He's one of the people that broke through the myth that it was all just, you know, the Nazis and so on. And this is one of those books where he rejects Marxism, but it's actually more Marxist than most Marxists writing about fascism. It's a very, very perceptive book. There's a chapter in there, he talks about the stages of the development of fascism taking root, which I keep coming back to for obvious reasons. Just about Egypt. Look, I think one of the points here is that we face more than one enemy, right? The fascists aren't our only enemy. In fact, we face more than one form of counter-revolution. I know the comrade didn't ask this directly, but I just want to say, you know, the counter-revolution that was launched in 2013 by the Sisi was a traditional military, assault. But one of the lessons I took from that is that counter-revolution can have a mass base, right? And I think that shocked a lot of the people in the revolution. I think, you know, the old police structures were destroyed, but not the core of the state machine. There was the illusion in the army, the people in the army. People used to talk about, I remember the phrase, I can't remember what it is in Arabic, about the remnants, as if there was just a tiny bit of the old regime left. And therefore, I think people underestimated that for the revolution to succeed, it would have to be much more ruthless at smashing up the old state machine and so on. In other words, you have to take counter-revolution seriously, and it comes in different forms. Why am I very wary of the phrase about neoliberal fascism? I think for some of the reasons that the comrade articulated. You see, I think what I'm against, I don't mind it as rhetorical flourish and so on, but I think there's a danger that fascism becomes this kind of index of how much something is terrible, right? You know, because many terrible things happen, terrible things, including genocidal things. The British Empire, the Raj, presided over genocides. I don't think the British Empire, I don't think the best way to understand it is fascism, because the essence of the issue is this question of working class organization. The fascist project is to smash all working class organization. I don't think that's Biden's project. I think that's the crucial, because to say that fascism has triumphed is to say that the possibility of resistance has been extinguished. And it hasn't. And we have to have different, it can be that mainstream forces working through reformist forces like the trade union bureaucracy and so on can be more successful at containing mass movements sometimes. Again, we face a variety of challenges. So this isn't an argument saying our only enemy is fascism, right? But we have to take fascism very seriously for the obvious reasons that we can't allow it to build to the point where it becomes a mortal threat to working class organization. And by the way, obvious point, but let's make it, having smashed working class organization, that's what then opens up the door to a logic of genocide. Could the Holocaust have happened if the German workers' movement hadn't been smashed? I don't believe so. That's why the Nazis smashed the working class first. I'm afraid I wasn't quite sure I caught the question about, so I'm going to make 2 points in terms of if we're talking about how do we give people confidence to come on demonstrations that are challenging the fascists and so on, there's a very simple point as well. Numbers matter, right? You have to win. I'm sorry, if there's only going to be a few of us, we still have to bloody do it. But our aim is always to win larger numbers. Because if you confront Tommy Robinson and there's 20 of us, you might think twice about coming again. There's 100,000 of us. You feel very confident, And if you don't want to be in the thick of the action, etc. There's a second question, which is about winning. How do you win the communities, racialized communities, the oppressed, that are targeted by the fascists? And here, I think there's a big responsibility on the anti-capitalist left, because you cannot fight fascism in what I would describe as an economistic. You just point out that really they have right-wing policies. You have to do all that, and they're really secret neoliberals, and you have to challenge their racism. This is one of the central glues. And if the anti-capitalist left particularly is utterly unequivocal, not just in words, but in practice, at challenging forms of racism, every form of racism, you can start to win the trust of communities to join you. I always find it, the Greek comrades, I think it's their Marxism equivalent, so they're not here, but they built a mass anti-fascist movement called Kirfa. What I'm always very impressed, I'd like to know more, is you always see what I think is a relatively new community of the Greek Pakistani community is very involved, because the anti-capitalist left, and our comments in particular, when there have been attacks on that community, they have stood with them. The truth is, there are many cities in Britain where the SWP has a relationship with parts of the Muslim community that's been built up because we've stood. We've not run away from the arguments about it. We've been very clear. And when you want to say to people, come on our demonstrations, and they're thinking, well, are you leading us into the lion's den here? You have to build that trust that you'll stand with them. And this has been a weakness of the French left. Things are changing. I wouldn't claim to be an expert on it. I think particularly a new young generation that's grown up in the banlieue is much more multicultural, much more multiracial. I think there's a younger left that is beginning, and a young Muslim left in France that are beginning to stand against Islamophobia. And you can see Mélenchon has moved a long way and takes much, much better positions on this. It's come very late in the day, but there is some movement on it. How long do I have left? 1 minute. I'm going to not answer John's question about Portugal then, although it's quite an important one. Because I do think there's a possibility, maybe fascism doesn't develop in its full form, but maybe fascists provide the shock troops for various forms of authoritarian order. To some extent, this is what I think happened with Franco and so on. It was a military dictatorship, military counter-revolution, but the fascists, the Falange, who were junior partners, I think they were more subordinate than the Nazis, but they were used to be the people who behind Franco would conquer a town and then let the Falange cleanse it, i.e. murder all the workers' movement and the left and so on. The last point I want to make, look, I made a point, didn't I, about the fascists raise a pseudo anti-establishment, anti-capitalist and revolutionary, and it can allow them to get into communities that traditional conservatives and so on can't reach, because they sound like they're angry at the system, the establishment. They don't pitch themselves, the Tories pitch themselves as they want to manage the system more competently. The Nazis say, we want to smash the system. That can get a resonance. And it means, therefore, and here, if you like, is my 7th strategic imperative for anti-fascists, we have to build the united front. It's a defensive shield. But we also have to combine that with the left and a workers' movement. We have to fight for an insurgent workers' movement, a genuinely insurgent movement. The interesting thing about the Anti-Nazi League is we did smash the Nazis. The movement was by and large going down in that period. But the crisis is so much deeper now that we need both tracks of an anti-fascist united front, but also a militant insurgent workers' movement left that's trying to galvanize a bigger workers' movement to provide a genuine pole of attraction that can eat into and destroy the Nazis' base of support. Okay, that's it.